In 1878, the British Empire still looked unstoppable, but this disaster in Afghanistan was one of the cracks that proved the empire wouldn't survive the century. Following on from our series, we now look at the Second Anglo-Afghan War. As always in this turbulent region of the world, business remains unfinished. In the decades following the 1860s, Russia was expanding its empire towards the south, incorporating once mighty kingdoms into its domain. With the conquest of Samarkand from the Emir of Bukhara, the borders of Afghanistan and Russia would come closer than ever, something that was unacceptable to the British. At this time, the British government had been replaced by Benjamin Disraeli's more conservative government, who were willing to take a more aggressive posture relating to foreign policy, and Afghanistan would become an unfortunate victim. In 1873, the British and Russian governments came to an agreement on designated spheres of influence. The mighty and ancient Oxus River would become the northern boundary between Afghanistan and Russia. In 1876, the British Empire was pursuing what was known as the Forward Policy, a strategy pushed by Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's government to expand British influence along India's northwestern frontier. As part of this initiative, British forces occupied Quetta, a strategically vital Afghan-held region in Baluchistan. This move was designed to pressure the Afghan government and create a buffer against perceived Russian advances. Once installed as the new Viceroy of India, Lord Edward Leighton aimed to turn Afghanistan into a de facto British protectorate. His plan required placing a permanent British envoy in Kabul, a symbol of direct political oversight. But Afghanistan's ruler, Amir Sher Ali Khan, immediately rejected the idea. He argued that the Afghan people would never tolerate a foreign representative living in their capital. It would be seen as an erosion of their Afghan independence and a betrayal of their sovereignty. The situation escalated in July 1878 when the Russian Empire sent an uninvited diplomatic mission to Kabul. Despite Sher Ali's protests, the Russians forced their delegation into the city, signaling Moscow's growing influence at a time when the British feared the so-called Great Game, a rivalry for control over Central Asia. When Viceroy Leighton learned that the Russian envoys had been welcomed or at least tolerated in Kabul, he reacted with outrage, interpreting it as a direct challenge to British authority and to their forward policy. He once again demanded that Sher Ali accept a British agent in the capital. Leighton even sent the envoy towards Afghanistan without waiting for approval. The Afghan frontier officers following Sher Ali's orders refused entry to the British envoy at the border, and for Leighton and the British government, this refusal was the final provocation. In 1878, the British invaded, a three-pronged attack with around 40,000 soldiers, travelling through the Khyber Pass, the Kurram Valley and the Bolan Pass, would converge on Afghanistan. Desperate, Sher Ali would make appeals to the Russian Tsar, but to no avail. The British would run into resistance at the Battle of Ali Masjid, where 3,000 British troops would face off against an Afghan army of similar size, but after a quick skirmish, the Afghan forces retreated and the British troops continued their march onwards. By January 1879, the British easily took over Jalalabad, forcing the Afghan emir to retreat to Russian-controlled lands, only to die months later. The British would support the succession of Yakub Khan, the son of Sher Ali, who would sign the Treaty of Gandamak in a village a few dozen miles away from Kabul. He would agree to allow a British permanent envoy in Kabul, and that the Afghan affairs with relation to foreign powers would have to go through the British. For a people with a great sense of pride and a history of resistance, this was a huge blow, and to add fuel to the fire, key areas of the Afghan kingdom were to be ceded to the British as part of India. These included the Kurram Valley, the Khyber Pass, and large swathes of Baluchistan. The position of envoy was handed over to Kavanari, However, history was to repeat itself on September 3rd, 1879. Afghan armies from the region of Herat were able to make their way to the British over unpaid payments, and after being turned away, they joined the locals and killed Kavanagh and other British officials in what seemed the repeat of the First Anglo-Afghan War. This was a fact noted by the British press. In October 1879, General Frederick Roberts occupied Kabul, leading to Amir Yakub Khan's abdication. Viceroy Leighton ordered massive reprisals. Entire neighborhoods were burned and punished, and the famous Bala Hisar fortress had sections including its arsenal blown to pieces. Later liberals in the British government would criticize the acts for its barbarity, but the British were careful not to cause too much destruction, so as to not alienate other Afghan factions, and after all, the troops needed a place to stay. With victory on their mind, the occupiers conducted a victory parade seeking a final solution to their Afghan problem. Calls were made to dismember the kingdom and even give Herat to the Persians if not a malleable emir could be found to remedy the situation. However, the main theatre of war was not yet over. In December 1879, 20,000 Afghan fighters surrounded Sherpur outside Kabul, but General Roberts managed to hold the fort. Over in the south, the Afghan emir was stoking a revolt. On the 27th of July 1880, one of the worst defeats suffered by the British forces during the Second Anglo-Afghan War was to occur. Expecting to confront only a small detachment of Ayub Khan's army, Brigadier General George Burroughs instead found himself facing a massive Afghan force of 25,000 to 30,000 men. These included regular soldiers, tribal fighters, and a strong artillery arm, whereas Burroughs' own force of around 2,500 troops and Indian troops was small in comparison. They formed a line near the village of Maiwand as a fierce artillery duel opened the battle, but disaster struck when two British guns captured from Ayub Khan earlier in the campaign exploded, collapsing morale and creating a fatal gap. Ayub Khan seized the moment, launching heavy artillery fire and massive infantry attacks and a cavalry charge. The British shattered, left and drove the whole line back under underwhelming pressure. The remnants of Burroughs' force withdrew towards Kandahar, suffering nearly 1,000 killed and 100 wounded, and as the Afghan forces pursued, the victory allowed Ayub Khan to advance on Kandahar and besiege the city, prompting General Frederick Roberts to undertake his celebrated Kabul to Kandahar march to relieve the garrison. But Maiwand remains one of the most celebrated Afghan triumphs and a searing humiliation for the British Empire. With the uprising in Kabul suppressed and Ayub Khan's advance defeated, the British turned to the problem of selecting a new Afghan ruler. After considering several candidates, they settled on Abdur Rahman, the nephew of the former Amir Sher Ali. He had recently returned from years of exile in Central Asia, and with substantial support amongst the northern tribal leaders. The British at first proposed limiting his authority to northern Afghanistan, leaving Kandahar under separate leadership, but Abdur Rahman refused to rule a divided country and made clear that he would not accept such an arrangement. Confident in his popularity and aware that his opposition could ignite renewed conflict, he insisted on full authority over Afghanistan and rejected the presence of a permanent British envoy, the very same demand that had sparked war with Sher Ali. Despite this irony, the British agreed. In exchange for subsidies and recognition, Abdur Rahman accepted British control over Afghanistan's foreign affairs, but kept all internal matters in his own hands. He permitted only limited non-political Indian commercial agents to enter Kabul, ensuring that no direct British political influence would take root. And so would end the Second Anglo-Afghan War.